Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's CHOW session on leveraging innovative technologies to combat IUU fishing and human trafficking. We will be recording today's session, and let me just as a reminder, please everyone, don't forget to mute your audio. So with that, my name is Sally Ozell and I am the Director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C. At Stimson, we focus on understanding security implications of climate change, wildlife trafficking, and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing. Our team works with partners around the globe to utilize a research to action model to develop policy recommendations and solutions and then implement them. So this has been the case in the Maritime Safe Act and also working to improve implementation of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program. So let me now introduce our very impressive panel of experts. We have Johan Bergenus, who is the Senior Vice President for Oceans at the World Wildlife Fund. James Chang, who is a policy advisor to Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. Eric Friesen is the Solutions Engineer at the company Planet. And then John Serafini, who is the CEO of HawkEye 360. And I want to particularly thank John and HawkEye for generously supporting today's panel. So before we hear from our panelists, what I'd like to do is provide a quick overview of IUU fishing. So IUU fishing is a global industry which generates annual profits of at least $36 billion a year and accounts for up to 20 to 50% of the global fish catch. IUU fishing affects most major markets around the globe, including the United States. And it's really fair to say that the majority of people joining CHOW have unknowingly consumed IUU fish. So let me define what IUU fishing means. Illegal, that's straightforward. That's when a vessel circumvents a law. For example, when a vessel enters another state's domestic waters without permission or is engaged in illicit activities. Unreported, that's the most common and toughest to identify. That's when legally flagged vessels who have an agreement to fish in another country's waters take more than their license allows. For example, their agreement may be for 5 tons of fish, but they end up taking 10 tons without reporting it. Unregulated, that's fishing that occurs in areas where there are no laws governing, particularly on the high seas. IUU fishing is also a security problem. It threatens food security, economic security, and environmental security. For example, 3 billion people depend on fish as their primary source of protein, and the fishing industry supports $1.5 trillion in economic activity each year globally. To say the least, it is big business. So IUU fishing not only drains coastal states of marine sources, but also deprives them of vital economic activity, food, and important tax revenues. The perpetrators of IUU fishing not only fish illegally, but they also engage in other illegal activity. This includes criminal networks engaged in nefarious activities where they utilize fishing vessels to traffic in illicit drugs, arms, and humans, as well as entities using shell companies to launder dirty money. And around the world, IUU fishing vessels have been linked to increasing geopolitical tensions with China in the South China Sea, and recently Chinese vessels around South America. Colombian narcotics are often smuggled on fishing vessels to West Africa en route to Europe. Iranian gun running in the Arabian Peninsula, and piracy off the Horn of Africa. So a couple of years ago, Stimson issued a report called Shining a Light, the Need for Transparency across distant water fishing. Our research showed IUU fishing is linked to distant water fishing fleets around the globe who fall under a very complex and opaque system. What we found, the top 5 distant water nations, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Spain, with China far outpacing all the other nations. And there is a lack of information about where these vessels operate, who owns them, the amount of fish they catch, how fish is moved along the seafood supply chain, including transshipment at sea. And information is also scarce about labor conditions and abuses that occur on distant water vessels, out of sight, out of mind. So greater transparency throughout the fishing industry is badly needed. In the United States, the Maritime Safe Act begins to address this by establishing an all-of-government approach to fight IUU fishing. It calls for increased data and intelligence sharing, expanded capacity for monitoring, enforcement, and training, and greater traceability in the seafood supply chain. Last month, new bipartisan legislation was introduced by Representatives Huffman and Graves, the Illegal Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this links IUU fishing and forced labor in the seafood supply chain and also makes seafood import monitoring more effective. So as we will hear today, innovative technologies are helping governments, the private sector, and civil society in surveillance, deterrence, enforcement, and prosecution of these perpetrators. There is much the US government and private sector and the NGO community can do when they join forces to end IUU fishing. So now we will hear from our panelists who will provide a brief 3 to 4 minute overview of their work before we engage in a robust dialogue, including questions from our virtual audience. So please tee up your questions by adding them to the chat function on your screen. Johan, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Sally, for that framing of our discussion. And thank you to my fellow panelists who represent all of the solutions, I think, or some of the solutions that I think we need to some of the problem sets that Sally presented to us. I'm the relatively new head of the WWF US Oceans program. And as part of that work, we have strategic initiatives on nature-based solutions. We focus on strategic places, building capacity for the prosperity of people and nature. And we look at strategic products such as fish and plastics, IUU fishing, and connections to labor and human rights issues, and work on data and other science and technology and innovation projects to that end. In terms of our competencies, as I said, market-driven solutions, science and technology, we manage program globally, we focus on communities, and we have a very sophisticated policy and advocacy program. So we are both wide and deep. So the issue at hand here today, I'll take a few minutes, and I'd like, since I have the honor of being first here today, I have the opportunity to take a step back and reflect a little bit about what we've seen here over the last 5 to 10 years. There's been some remarkable progress done, in no small part to the investments that the philanthropic and the private sector community has made, including the people on this panel. And I think it's important to recognize that. We have remote sensing platforms today that we could only dream about a few years ago. We have on the water and underwater technologies that serves as platforms to detect, monitor, and manage IUU fishing and other maritime issues. We have DNA technology, we have blockchains, we have standardized data sets opportunities to understand the supply chain. Some of the folks on the screens here are intimately involved in machine learning and artificial intelligence ventures that has helped us to build products that can attack niches of this problem, from traceability to enforcement to broader transparency. So the community is coming together around this issue, which is amazing. I have also seen this firsthand. I pride myself of having seen probably more maritime operations room that most people combined in the world over the last 5-6 years, having traveled extensively. And I've seen a great proliferation in operations rooms around the world of technologies. So we have some game-changing momentum here, which I'm excited about, but we need to continue to innovate, demonstrate, measure our impact, and importantly, build sustainable business models that can make this great momentum continue. Which leads me to the second point I want to make. We need more resources. The philanthropic and the private sector community, as I've said, has done a great job at driving resources into this space. I'm encouraged by how Congress and the executive branch is starting to highlight some of these issues as a national security issue. That is going to be monumental to increasing resources and stakeholders and capacity. But it's not only about folks like James and Congress to provide resources to this issue. the private sector and the not-for-profit sector has a huge opportunity to streamline how we tell those who have legislative, appropriation, and executive power of what type of technology specs is needed to build the right type of product. And I don't want to talk out of turn here, but James and I, over the last few years, have spent quite a bit of time together with his colleagues to try to come up with an organic, streamlined process of how we can tell the story with the users of what needs to be built and what type of resources that we need for NOAA, US Coast Guard, Department of Justice, and Navy. So this leads me to my final point, and this is my dream state. When I go across the river, I live in Washington, D.C. When I go across the river to Virginia and Arlington, I see this amazing around Pentagon high rises full of technology and innovation organizations who are supplying the military and security complex with products to complete that mission set. I don't know if the people of Silver Spring would like this, but I would love Silver Spring and NOAA to look like that in 10 years, full of skyscrapers with innovators and technology folks who are part of an ecosystem that works with clear tech specifications, demonstration opportunities, money in the system, and companies who understand that how in a streamlined way, providing some of these ocean health and national security organizations with this type of new generation technology. So super proud to be part of this panel. I include some of the cutting edge folks and leaders in Congress. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. Great points. Now let me turn the screen over to James.
I apologize for being a bit plain-spoken relative to our other distinguished panelists, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you folks. I've been up here in DC since 2000. I initially worked for Senator Inoue, and we oversaw the transition from the Northwestern Hawaiian Island Coral Reef Ecosystem Reserve into the first iteration of the Papahanaumakea Marine National Monument. And then I went to NOAA for a couple of years and came back to work for Senator Schatz. And with Mr. Schatz, we expanded Papahanaumakea to its full current extent, which is 583,000 square miles. And if I wanted to be trite, I'd say it was 583,000 square miles of opportunity. But the reality is that it's 583,000 miles of a lot of stuff we got to do. My work for Senator Schatz focuses on the resource management, right? Because, you know, if you can say that, you know, like the forests are like the lungs of the planet or something like that, then you probably ought to own that the oceans are its gills. And so please kokua and don't break it. And what that means is that whatever we can do to manage the area is super important, but it's the IUU side. I can throw money at it to manage it, you know, as much as I can with the help of the appropriators, but unless we have adequate IUU enforcement, those are actors that are not even within the United States. And we rely on partners like you folks to, you know, like some of the panelists here today, to try and figure out what the best path forward is. And so as we were talking about, as my colleagues pointed out, the ecological stakes and the human stakes, I'd like to add yet another layer of human stakes, and that is the question of heritage. And that is that of all the places on the planet, the only place where you can go back and see and experience the same Hawaii that the native Hawaiians did is in our Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, in Papahanaumakea. And the more that these people steal from us, the more that they take, well, you know, they're putting stuff on plates, but the more that they take, the more that they break the heritage of the native Hawaiians, the more that they break the one place that is currently a strong connection to the Hawaii of the past, the one place where we can take our junior navigators to experience the sea the same way that their ancestors did. And that is what is at stake, in addition to all the other things that our panelists have put onto the table. I wanted to bring that out for you folks, and so that you could understand that there is more than just the than just the planet, right? There's more than just the substantial security risks. It is our own connection, our own humanity, our own connection to a past, to a people who understood how to create and how to build a completely sustainable environment and society and a way to live so that they could rely on the land by making it more abundant, by fattening it up, by making it plenty, by making the oceans plentiful. That's how the Native Hawaiian theories for resource use was. Not as much as you can get before it breaks, but rather to make it so fat, to make it so abundant, to make it so plentiful that there's enough for all. When IUU fishing breaks the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which I genuinely pray that it never does, then it breaks Papahanaumakea. It breaks that connection. It breaks that piece of all of us. And that is why it is a World Heritage Site. And since, today, at this year's CHOW, we are looking at my place, I wanted to bring that part into the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thanks for bringing that home to all of us in a real place. With that, I will now say, Eric, the screen is yours.
So I'm Eric Friesen. Again, as the others have said, thank you to all the panelists for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this. There's a nice variety of solutions we might be able to come at, or at the very least, ideas. But my name is Eric Friesen. I'm a solutions engineer at Planet. Specifically, I work on the federal team. My job is basically to work with the users, kind of along the lines of what Johan said, of figuring out what the solutions are, figuring out what we need to be making for you. Not so much on product, but working hand in hand with the actual users. Now, a little bit about what exactly Planet is. You might have heard of us, you might not. Chances are you've seen our imagery before, even if you haven't heard of us. We're a satellite imaging company. Our big mission has been to image the whole world every day so that you can see change, and to make that change and that data accessible to as many people as possible and make it actionable. So how do we do that? We operate 2 constellations of satellites. We've actually launched about 500 satellites in our entire history. We currently operate about 200. Most of them are in what's called our PlanetScope constellation. It's comprised of Dove satellites. They're about the size of a loaf of bread. And they image the Earth at about 3.5 to 4 meters. They're 4-band imagers. We have some new Super Doves up. That's actually about half the fleet now that do 8-band imaging hardware-wise. Right now, we're putting out 5 bands of that imagery. Then we also have SkySats. These don't image everything all the time. They're tasking-based, but they image 4 bands, red, green, blue, near infrared, at 50 centimeter resolution. These are actually the bread and butter of our open water monitoring. Our PlanetScope satellites tend to stick to coastal parts of the waters, but we do have them monitoring some reefs and atolls and other things like that. Oh, I skipped this one. There we go. So just some examples of our imagery kind of in the appropriate setting. Back late last year, we're looking at the South China Sea. You can see a little bit a cluster of ships here on September 4th. Step forward to September 20th, you can see more ships. I forget where exactly in the South China Sea this is, but do remember this one made the news. This one is from one of our SkySats. This is that 50 centimeter imagery. December 24th, same general area, just zoomed into a specific portion of it. And then back out to our Doves. This is back in March of this year. And again to one of our SkySat shots. This one's zoomed out a little bit. So larger maybe ideas for approaching some of these problems. A few of our customers, a few of our partners are already actually using our data to combat IUU. Global Fishing Watch makes use of our tasking imagery. I believe our daily monitoring imagery as well in coastal regions. You can see over here on the medium resolution imagery, you can still spot ships pretty clearly, especially a little bit of a breeze. Now you combine that with AIS data, or when you don't have AIS data, you combine that with the information gleaned from HawkEye 360's satellites. to kind of build up a pattern of usage, a pattern of fishing. You can begin to target our high resolution satellites more accurately and confirm exactly what's going on. So it's one thing to say there's something out in the ocean, but you want to confirm the activity. And here's another actual specific example of the way the imagery played out. This is a slightly older one. We actually lowered our SkySats last year to get them down to 50 centimeters. So this is before we did that, when we had 80 centimeter imagery. We had the medium res imagery spot some activity, tasked some satellites off of it, and got confirmation of a fishing fleet there where they weren't supposed to be. Cool. That's it for me. Go ahead and hand it back over.
Great, thank you, Eric. That's really neat to see that. Very, very helpful, I'm sure, to many, including myself. With that, let me now turn the screen over to John, who is again, thank you for your sponsorship of this panel. John.
Oh, a pleasure. Very nice to be with you. And let me just mention, James, your comments were beautiful and inspirational. Thank you for sharing them with us. So HawkEye, about a 5-year-old company, raised close to $200 million worth of capital. And what we're building is a very unique constellation of small satellites. They have never before existed in the commercial world. It's always been within the classified domain to fly satellites for the purposes of analyzing RF. So we have a satellite that flies in front, a second behind, and a third that oscillates back and forth. And with that unique architecture, we can effectively geolocate signals above a watt in power between 144 megahertz and 18 gigahertz. We can detect signals, we can associate them with specific objects, be it an aircraft, a vessel, a military entity, etc. And then we can track that object into the future, maintain chain of custody, and then very importantly, being able to extract intelligence about that object. And with our own proprietary data science, we're able to learn a lot about objects. Just thinking about the maritime domain in particular, we can detect specific vessels, where they've been in the past, what kind of cargo they may have, who the captain is, who the crew are, and then we can make forecasts as to where that vessel will be in the future and what kind of activities that vessel may be participating in. And what's important is that this whole setup of technology works in cooperative and uncooperative environments. So obviously, a cooperative environment will be a vessel that's emitting a truthful AIS. But as we all are very aware, it's not difficult to turn off the AIS. It's not difficult to spoof the AIS. And frankly, it's not difficult to have someone else spoof your AIS. So in a world where you can't trust that data, how do you still track those vessels? How do you understand what those vessels, presumably bad actors, are doing and what they will do in the future? Well, the answer is they're still emitting, of course. How do you communicate? How do you navigate in a maritime environment? You have X-band radar, you have S-band radar, you have push-to-talk radio systems, emergency broadcast systems, and of course, L-band satellite communication capabilities. All of that emits, and a company like HawkEye 360 can detect that. We can use it to fuse it into an object identifier and then start to extract intelligence about that vessel. When our full constellation is on orbit, in about 18 months, we'll have 10 clusters capable of a revisit rate every about 15 minutes, and we're on Earth. And what's important here is not just the RF domain, but it's multiple different modalities on orbit and open source intelligence working together in collaboration. It's referred to as a multi-in product. And so we need to be very good at tipping and queuing other satellite modalities, like Planet, like other Earth observation, and importantly, other synthetic aperture radar satellites that are up there. And we want to be exceptionally good at detecting anomalous RF activity, associating it with illegal fishing, detecting trawling activity, for example, being able to send a tip to an Earth observation asset. And that asset comes overhead, take an image, and then we want to put that information together and service the appropriate interdiction authority, Coast Guard, Navy, etc., NOAA, with the intelligence product for them to do the interdiction. And very importantly, to then have the evidentiary proof for prosecution of that bad activity. And that's what we're doing. Secondly, what makes this all hum is you need to eventually take the person, the analyst, as much out of the loop as possible. It just isn't cost effective if you have a bullpen of analysts sitting and analyzing data. All of that needs to be shifted to data science and new, remarkably impressive capabilities in machine learning and artificial intelligence will allow the industry at line speed to look at dots on a map or pixels on a map and to be able to convert that into actionable insights about the world around us, particularly as it relates to illegal fishing, such that activities or action can be taken to prevent this bad activity from occurring in the future. The last thing I mentioned, for example, some may have seen the vignette we put out into the media as a subject of an Economist article quite recently, where we tracked the Chinese state fishing fleet as they circumnavigated the Earth, plague of locusts just sucking up natural resources, but they parked themselves outside of the Galapagos on the very boundary of that maritime economic exclusion zone. And we watched them. We identified when they went across the line, when they started acting in conduct that would be aligned with illegal fishing. And we tipped and cued to our partner Airbus's synthetic aperture radar satellites, pulled all that down, and we put it right into the media. Tried to put as much public spotlight as we could on this bad activity. I'm so pleased that there's other people on this panel and of course, other people who are participating who care deeply about this cause. And thank you all for your involvement.
Thanks so much, John. That really paints a detailed picture. You know, I'm going to kind of go in the opposite direction from how we started with some questions. And I'm going to first cue off, John, what you just talked about. So obviously, there have been recent reports about thousands of Chinese flag vessels that have been fishing for squid off of the Argentine coast over the last several years. And what seems to be they suddenly disappear from view when they shut off their AIS. So can you tell us in a little more detail how you and HawkEye's product offerings are different than just AIS? And when you combine them with other things, how can you offer this up to governments to really go after the bad actors through enforcement and et cetera?
Well, I'm happy to jump and take lead on that. Maybe I'll turn it over to Eric for his perspectives at Planet, because obviously they deal in different modalities as well. As I mentioned to you earlier, really it's a function of what happens when someone is a bad actor and takes the very natural step of wanting to be hidden. And obviously disguising their AIS or spoofing it is a natural movement forward. We're able to detect a wide range of different signals. We have effectively software-defined radios and the appropriate antenna configuration on each of our 3 satellites that are in the cluster. And these work together in order to be able to perform what we're referred to as a 3-ball geolocation. That 3-ball geolocation can get us down to hundreds of meters of accuracy, which in a maritime environment, fantastic. It also allows us to do tipping and cueing to other assets. Again, we don't present ourselves as the only modality that matters in the intelligence ecosystem. It's got to be a multi-int relationship. But what I will point out, which is extremely important, especially in a maritime environment, is that RF is only defined by humanity. A dolphin doesn't key a mic. A lake isn't going to give off X-band radar. It's only a human. So when you see a signal, be it X-band radar, S-band radar, push-to-talk radio system, you know that there's human activity down there that's waiting to be discovered. And unlike an EO or a SAR image, you look down and you don't get half the answer. It's when they key that mic, when they communicate, when we use that information to detect rendezvous, or to be able to map trawling, that you start to extract intelligence about human behavior. And if you do this long enough, you can start to learn about human intentions. And that's really where it gets exciting. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sean. Well, so Eric, sort of building off of that, we in our work have seen Chinese vessels illegally fishing in North Korea, and you had that on one of your slides. So with that, sort of what when you think about new types of satellites or sensors that maybe are not yet in orbit, what do you think are going to be the game changers, and how can you use them to sort of work with NOAA and DOE and others to again, get at these bad actors?
Well, I think both in terms of stuff not in orbit and stuff not in orbit in like large amounts. With the RF spectrum, as John said, is huge. Humans are the only thing putting RF out on the water as far as we know. In terms of other possible sensors, if we're talking spaceborne things, LiDAR is getting to be a big thing in terms of spaceborne sensors. Typically people think about that in terms of land, but if you've got a relatively flat ocean and you get a sudden high return of a LiDAR beam, something that is an ocean is under that beam and it can trigger tipping off something else. Similarly, just plain old imaging, but with hyperspectral sensors could be a big deal. I actually cut my teeth on astroimagery, which is hyperspectral data. And that gives you a lot of options for kind of doing the fingerprinting process that John was talking about. And then, yeah, that's really the big ones right there in terms of spaceborne ones.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it back to James for a minute to focus, if we could, on, again, back on Papahanaumakea, which is one of the largest, marine sanctuary in the U.S. group. So, James, you know, you talked about the heritage and the culture being lost, but how can MPAs like Papahanaumakea actually play a role in the enforcement of IUU fishing?
Thanks, Sally. That is a really good opportunity for me to pivot the cultural issue that I led with into solution sets, right? Because the thing that Papahanaumakea has that other plots of ocean do not have is a community of support and a community of interest. It is a focal point for resources. It's a focal point for people. And the thing that's really exciting to me about all the different technologies that have emerged to become an ecosystem of for remote enforcement is the promise that they hold to allow more people in to the solution set, right? That it's not just, you know, oh, Coast Guard got to go out and kind of feel their way and figure out how, you know, kind of figure out in their own, you know what I mean, in their own cramped way, how and where to deploy their resources. Now we have multiple players who can work together to protect this thing that is actually important to all of us, whether you look at it from an ecological, from a security, or from a heritage standpoint. And the fact that you have all of these technologies, right? With Papa, you have a reason to bring them all together and figure out, do the difficult math of how you layer all of these different pieces together to actually do the holy grail of enforcement, right? Get people convicted, get them into whatever penal system they correctly belong to, and get them serving time. Because once you get there and once you get those consequences, then you start to have the deterrence power as well, and it starts to pay off. And what Papa does, right, is that it gives a focal point for all of those things, and it really shines a light through its science and through its management, what we can do to what these areas mean for the health of the oceans writ large, and why it is so important to figure out how to protect them from IUU fishing. And once we get that secret sauce right, then we start to apply it more broadly to the rest of the ocean. Because whatever interlock of all the different technologies that are available, and let me tell you, sitting as a congressional staff, I hear a lot about them. Whatever recipe we come up with to put those layers together in a way that empowers action and prosecution and deterrence, that's what Papahanaumakea adds to it, right? In addition to all the other values that we have been discussing.
Oh, thank you. That is, again, another real case example of bringing technologies together in a real place to make real meaningful action, as you say. Thank you. So, Johan, I have a question for you. So last week, the European Union, issued a second yellow card to Ghana, warning that they are going to lose access to the European seafood market unless they do more to tackle IUU fishing in their EEZ. And as we all know, in recent years, Ghanese waters have been plagued by illegal fishing, largely from Chinese vessels. So what are some of the impactful ways that the NGO conservation community can really contribute to technology and innovations to combat IUU fishing? You talked about them earlier, But, we've had some questions that are also focusing on execution and prosecution. If you could address that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. And I think it piggybacks on what was John and Eric was talking about before, is that they have made the investments now to get us to a place to understand what is happening on the oceans. And if you work in the half dozen or maybe a dozen so countries that actually has an ability to send steel out into the water or to get to the left of the issue and be somewhere in advance of the bad actor behavior, that's fantastic. But if you go south in the Western Hemisphere, you're not going to have that capabilities in the prosecutorial system, in the enforcement system, even in the marine biology or environmental system. And I think that's where an organization like ours come in to work on the ground and build capacity in partnership with an ever increasing group of stakeholders, so that when sophisticated technology is made available, there is a baseline level of an opportunity to take the type of actions that we are seeing in developed countries now. So that's number one, which depend, of course, on this sort of developing nation partnership. So I think that's an important piece of it. And I think John actually wanted to jump in here. He looked eager at the end of James's comments here. And maybe, I'll ask a question to you. If there is, in your work, how do you work with countries who doesn't have the type of budgets that we have in the United States? And is there anything we can do to help, both on James' side or in my not-profit side? And I'm sorry, I'm stealing your thunder, Sally, as the moderator here.
It's a discussion. Let's discuss.
Well, I think to answer that question, the answer is you can't provide raw data or lightly refined data to another country and expect them to have the sophistication and the processing and the analysis and the time in which to do that work themselves and come to a conclusion on a finished intelligence product to then be able to execute against it. Just like our Coast Guard is very low latency requirements, so do all of our peer and partner countries. And we need to be issuing to them answers so that they can take that data and run with it very rapidly and be able to achieve results quickly. Just giving more data to more people doesn't solve anything. But I would, and just to follow on that for a moment, we have tried to work within the EXIM Bank ecosystem. And what we found is when you're selling obviously into military type customers, that falls on the other side of the line of what's permissible. The Coast Guard is in that gray zone, and maybe some of the participants here have had experience successfully selling commercial technologies through EXIM Bank to the Coast Guard, but we have not found that to be a very clear process. And it needs to be easier, because if the Coast Guards of different countries had better access to intelligence products, finished intelligence products that the US government could export, we have a better chance of being successful. The last thing I've mentioned, I just want to follow up with what James was talking about, and that is across all of our US government, the missions that we ask our capabilities to take on, defense, intelligence, security, civil, they greatly outstrip the resources that we equip them with. I mean, $715 billion feels like a lot for defense intelligence, but compared to the threats we have today, it's not. And the only way to bridge that gap, in my humble opinion, is by really leveraging commercial technologies. And it shouldn't just be about defense intelligence security applications, but rather our great capabilities of In-Q-Tel and DIU, and SoftWorks and AFWorks that are bringing great technologies to bear in the defense, intelligence, and security world. Those need to be made available for things like illegal fishing. If environmental protection is going to be a key part of what we do as a defense, then those same infrastructures like DIU need to be charged with go and find technologies to help solve these global tragedies of the common. Thank you.
Thank you. And I notice everyone is nodding their head vigorously. Unfortunately, I'm looking at the time and we've kind of run out of time, but I think the message that I just heard from John and all of us, whether you're NOAA, DOD, Coast Guard, ODNI, many actors who are working in the IU space in the federal government, two things. We need to bring in the private sector more. We need to use the assets and make them more accessible. We really need these true partnerships, not just talk about them, but do them, because we all hear from our colleagues in the government that their budgets are tight. So if we integrate, as the Maritime Safe Act is supposed to do, I really think we can get to a place where the private sector in its commercial area, the NGO sector in its on the ground work, Congress, when they're building up the appropriations for these agencies, let's all get together, because we got to end this IUU, folks, whether it's because of the natural resource loss, as I said, the food security, the environmental security, and the economic security for many countries. With that, I'm going to close and say thank you to everyone for joining such a great panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally.